My name is Marlene Theodore. I am the Jane and Gerald Katcher Curator of Programs, and it is my pleasure to be here with all of you in this hall and all of you on Zoom. It is true that John does not need an introduction, not in this room, not with this crowd, but I cannot pass up the opportunity to sing the praises of my friend, my mentor, and my collaborator. And for that, like last year, I have the help of our Zoom audience, the hundreds of you who have clearly delighted in this series and have dutifully completed our survey at the end of the lectures. When asked their primary reason for attending the series, the answer is, quite simply and on repeat, John Walsh. John Walsh is a superb teacher. Walsh is one of the great art historians, and I would listen to John Walsh talk about anything. And more than once we heard, quote, I love Cezanne and I love John Walsh. And honestly, same. What did our audiences enjoy most? Everything, quote unquote. John Walsh wove history and art together beautifully. I love how he describes in detail the various elements of a painting and how they relate to one another. He really made me look at those apples. The depth of interpretation that Walsh brings to each flick of the brush and each layer of paint from the palette knife. The humor John weaves throughout his delivery. This is a room of oohs and ahs, laughter and surprise, and that's not just on April Fool's Day. We value all of your feedback, so I'll make a plea for it here. Please keep the feedback coming, dear Zoom audience. And to all of you here in McNeil, we invite you to join in by scanning the QR code as you're leaving. They're at the exit doors and completing the survey. One audience member appreciated the mix of close-looking comparison to other paintings and the artistic and social contexts Walsh provides. John's approach makes art accessible. We look together in the context of these lectures, and John teaches us, empowers us to continue this type of sustained close looking on our own, to talk about what we're seeing and to listen to the perspective of others. It's no surprise that so many of you went up to the European galleries to spend time with Cezanne's paintings following these lectures. This is John's 11th series at the museum. There have been more than 60 lectures, all of which live on the gallery's YouTube channel, and they have been viewed over 1 million times. Wow. And to everyone wondering, we are video recording this series, and it will soon be online. The impact of John's practice is enormous. I'm so grateful for all the ways he supports the educational mission of this museum and how he has been a partner in teaching and engagement. Thank you, John. I'm not done yet. It may be the year of Cezanne, but it's our week with John Walsh, and we are so lucky to have you and Jill here with us at Yale and here with us in New Haven. Thanks also to all of you for being here, for filling this lecture hall in McNeil, for all of you on Zoom. Thanks to the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund and the John Walsh Education and Lecture Fund for supporting this program. And with that, I give you John Walsh and Cezanne's last years and the great projects.
Marlene, thank you. You're my producer and director and employer, and I am very grateful to you, and I'm very happy to see so many people here, and I'm happy to be talking to the people whom I can't see on Zoom. We've reached in this series 1890, and Cezanne has turned 50. He's in Aix-en-Provence, where he's been spending most of his time after 30 years of moving back and forth between Paris and his native south. He's recently married Hortense Fiquet, his longtime companion, and they have a teenage son. Cezanne's banker father had died a few years earlier and made him financially independent. He's got a few enthusiastic collectors and critics, but he still hasn't had an exhibition in Paris. and he won't have for another 6 years. In the next 15 years, until his death, he's going to undertake several major projects, returning to subjects that he's already treated, but are about as different from each other as they could possibly be. He's been painting portraits of late, many of his wife, and soon he'll paint a few important friends, all out of gratitude and none for profit. And now, back in Aix, he's bringing local people into the studio one by one, people whose names we've mostly lost, and local men playing cards. Off and on during the 1890s, he's had another major project going, and that is groups of nude bathers. Again, not a new subject for him, but the outcome will be the biggest and most ambitious paintings that he'll ever make. And during all this, he's out in the countryside, making painting after painting of the Arc River Valley and Mont Saint-Victoire, taking himself to the edge of abstraction. He says what he wants to do is to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. And when he's in the mood or when the weather's bad, there's still life. That was just a quick preview of what we're going to see today. It was last year's. At the end, we'll look briefly at how the next generation of artists absorbed the lessons of Cézanne's work and life, and why he came to be called so often the father of modern art. Well, we're going to start here with this composition of 3 men playing cards, giving the game their fullest attention. The painting is 6 feet wide. Let's give it our full attention for just a minute. Well, you see they're sitting at a painted table with a tray. Behind them is a gray wall. At the left, a jug on a bracket, a picture in a gilt frame, a rack of clay pipes, and a heavy swag of golden yellow curtain. We don't see their eyes or expressions, and neither do they. They rest their forearms on the table, and they lean forward, absorbed. Here's its habitat, the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia. The figures are life-size or close to it. The composition looks balanced because Cézanne made a lot of careful adjustments of visual weight and counterweights. On the right side is the bulk of the man and his coat, plus the mass of the curtain and the little spectator. On the left, there's an extra adult and a great blotch of shadow on the wall. The balance is sturdy. It's kind of the base of a pyramid. The contrasts are subtle, like the profiles of the 2 men facing each other. On the right, he's silhouetted against the light, and on the left, a light profile against the dark. Now, all this formal stuff I've just been saying would be tedious, except that it reinforces the situation, the action, which is entirely mental, men making calculations about what should come next. Are they just wasting time? Their wives might say so, after all. But card plays have been emblems, card playing, of proverbially foolish behavior in paintings and book illustrations for centuries. There was and is a picture in the local museum in Aix by the great 17th century painter Mathieu Lelin, showing a couple of off-duty soldiers at a table cheating a young soldier at cards and making sure we're in on the scam. But in the Cézanne, there's really nothing to object to. On the contrary, we might want to see Cézanne's picture as a kind of affectionate celebration of the lives of ordinary working people and of the eternal, simple pleasures of friendly competition and distraction. Well, Cézanne thought enough of this subject to keep at it, and he painted 4 more versions in different formats. I put them on the screen in proportion to their actual size. You see right below the Barnes picture a second, smaller and simpler version that you know from the Metropolitan, just below it, and 3 different versions of a kind of 2-figured composition with a setting more like a cafe, all evidently painted within just a few years. So why this subject all of a sudden? That's long been a puzzle. But Nina Atanasoglu published an ingenious answer fairly recently. And in Provence, for generations, card playing was not only the key to the traditional leisure activity of gambling, but it supported a local craft industry of printing playing cards. That was under threat in the early 1890s. The government in Paris was trying to discourage gambling as a social evil and was debating a stiff sales tax on playing cards, plus restrictions on their manufacture. This was a hot local issue. Cézanne was all for Provençal autonomy, and he had a boyhood friend who was the deputy, the representative for their region, and he was a fiery opponent of card laws. Cézanne had a deep respect for local working people. It's very easy to imagine him moved to produce pictures of plain, respectable Provençal working men at leisure, not handling money, not drinking, but doing what their ancestors had always done, playing cards. And you can imagine the pictures selling to sympathetic buyers. Well, before we let them go, let me show you 2 large drawings for the opposing men. This one for the younger one, with outlines clearly defined and delicate suggestions of blue and yellow, like notes to himself for when it came to painting the picture. And this drawing, also big, has outlines defined and also delicate suggestions of color. At the same time, Cézanne is painting local people, one by one, in his studio. At the left is a gardener, shown out of doors, a plain man in the rough-spun brown and tan clothes and soft hat of the region. And his pose, literally straightforward. No gestures, no emotion, evidently, and no play acting. On the right, it's the same man in the studio, resting or maybe daydreaming, dressed up a few notches, presenting himself more like a studio model, surrounded by stuff of the studio with a painting tacked up on the wall behind him. The painting actually is a still life by Cézanne, no surprise, painted 25 years earlier, that he'd brought south with him. Well, in a similar pose, a young woman in a corner with her hand on the back of a chair and a patterned fabric, all slightly askew. The label gives the traditional title, Young Italian Woman, but she's not an Italian woman. She's wearing the traditional, the characteristic big scarf and puffy sleeves of a woman from Arles, 50 miles west of here. She's an Arlésienne, the character type made famous by the play by Daudet and the music by Bizet, and in paintings by Vincent van Gogh. She may have come to work at the Jardin Bouffin, the parents' house. She looks at us. Her body language and expression seem to express kind of fatigue with flavors of sulky boredom and pique. The brushwork is confident, as confident as it gets with Cézanne, without being showy. He paints the face and arms with sort of distinct zones of orange and ochre, and the shadows with vivid blue. The patterned fabric is just breathtaking, and we'll see more of it. We don't know what her name was either, the sitter for this commanding portrait of a middle-aged woman in a setting that's most likely the kitchen at the Jardin de Buffon, with a paneled cabinet behind, an oilcloth on the table, and a plunger coffee pot. Everything in the picture, again, is just a little off the vertical. Even the teaspoon that's trying to stand up straight, but not quite succeeding. She looks serious, but not necessarily severe, not relaxed either, with a kind of working class readiness to be helpful, and with real dignity. Another local, two more locals. Cézanne posed the one in the blue smock in front of an 18th century painted decorative screen in the house that Cézanne must have enjoyed painting in a sort of summarizing in a big sketchy washes of his own. The man is 100% Provençal from one look at his outfit. Blue smock, jacket under, red scarf, pork pie hat. So it's a sample of local color being worn by a solid, thoughtful man. The other is more a study in mood. A man in clothing worn by Provençal men of upper class, artisan class, sits in the studio, and on the floor you can see one of Cézanne's palettes and some picture frames behind him. You also see the artist has bent the chair rail arbitrarily, as if to say, okay, I'll make space where I need it. Same with the man's left arm. Try connecting his left elbow with his left hand. Go ahead. The head is unforgettable, including the out-of-alignment eyes. His skin is painted with pinkish tones, shadowed with floating gray patches, and accentuated by bright red highlights. The wall is even more arbitrary, like a darkening sky behind his head with a little agitation that could suggest his thoughts. What he's thinking, it might be better not to ask. After the forced sale of the Jardin de Buffon at his brother-in-law's insistence, Cézanne had to make do in town while he had a studio built for him on the hill up north of town. You'll be seeing more of it soon. Up there at the far right comes the 65-year-old painter bringing a chair for a guest. This is where he made the greatest of his last portraits, of his gardener, an elderly man called Vallier, who tended the terraced garden behind the house that you see in this really breathtaking watercolor. First, he made the elaborate pencil sketch at the left, repeating the curves to approximate the outlines. He has Vallier look down and hold his arms folded. There are tree trunks on the other side seem to contain him. In the very sketchy oil painting on the right, he sits more upright. The bracketing trees are gone, and the backdrop is foliage, and at the left, vertical shades of blue and ochre, like drapes. And now we see his face. Blues and ochres in broad strokes take over. Now this is oil paint, diluted and translucent, behaving like watercolor, and the canvas behaving almost like paper. Now, indoors, same man, turned sideways. His bulky blouse and sleeve are accentuated. They fill most of the picture. The contours are in motion, with kind of from the wiggling brim of his hat on down. The placement of his arms isn't quite resolved, and the colors are just suggested. In the oil painting, however, it's all resolved. He has a fierce face on a slimmer body, picked out from an obscure background by light that sort of plays over his amazing coat, sort of proto-camo pattern, which Cézanne paints in patches of ochre and blue and gray and green, and on top, black lines again, drawn with the brush to give life and energy to the picture. We can only imagine what Cézanne saw in this man, Vallier, or intended us to see, a man of his own age, who's endured, who makes no appeal to us and doesn't reveal much either. Cézanne's image summons up the profiles of venerable men painted by artists of the museums, Rembrandt in the middle, Titian on the right. So he gives to the gardener Vallier the honor of being recorded for posterity and using a formula handed down since antiquity. Vallier makes a last appearance in this strange, dark portrait, a picture I find very hard to look at. It's as far as Cézanne goes to constructing a figure out of slabs of paint, layering them and reworking them. The three-quarter angle pose brings out his expression, which registers to me as a kind of defiance that goes very well with the painter's sort of to hell with it finish. You see not just the audacious detached swipes of yellow for the cheeks and neck and nose, but also in the beard, the long threads and flicks of bright blue paint on top of the shadows. Well, we could wish that Cézanne had given himself the honor of an image of such tremendous strength. But we have only these three from his last years. We have the strong watercolor at the right, showing himself as a busy man whose attention we've just gotten for a moment. The lithograph in the center was ordered up by his dealer, Vollard, and shows him behind an easel in a fairly routine drawing without much energy. The painting shows him when he was suffering from diabetes, as well as chronic bouts of anger and self-doubt. Here again, he covers his baldness with a soft hat and appears dispirited, vacant, shoulders slack, and the brushwork lacking energy too. Here he sat for his portrait by his admirer, the painter, Émile Bernard, and behind him on the easel is one of the last great projects, 3 canvases that he'd been working on for several years. With them in mind, he'd not only had that big studio built, he'd had the builder make a slot in the wall so he could skid them out of doors to work on if he needed to. And the subject? Women bathing out of doors. The painting behind him is the first of those. It's 7 feet wide. It hangs high in the Barnes collection near the card players, where it's not as easy to see. But we can do that. Let's just look at it for a moment. If the picture strikes you as weird and disagreeable, you're not alone. The scene is set in a forest glade where clouds or steam or maybe smoke are rising. There's a basket of fruit down front, a sleeping dog, and a kettle spilling over. It seems like it could almost be a gathering of young witches. Relationships among them are not clear. The anatomies are approximate. The figures at the far left and the far right seem to have come from some other compositions. The flesh is modeled in patches, and it shows signs of heavy, repeated reworking. I think the kindest opinion of a jury would be ambitious, followed by unresolved. Well, Cézanne didn't study nude models from life. He had been making compositions of women bathing off and on for many years, though, using drawings that he'd made of the figures in museum paintings and sculptures and in Renaissance engravings, rather than live models. It seems that he was squeamish in the presence of unclothed women. Just once, his dealer Vollard hired a female model for him, and he made a few studies, including the two in the middle, but everything else he based on memory or comparison with his own drawings. In earlier lectures, I've shown you small paintings by Cézanne of bathers in many different configurations and in quite different settings. Here's the second large version. This one in London, similar deep blue sky, muted light, blue shadows. There are a few more women and a lot less confusion. The bizarre creature in the Barnes version at the upper left with the vestigial head is replaced in the London version by a woman striding in and embracing her neighbor. The classical Andromeda at the upper right in the Barnes picture is gone, hanging from the tree. There's still a dog and fruit, but the foreground has been cleaned up, and the composition is a lot more coherent. Most of the group leans in, and together they launch a kind of sweeping upward curve that's carried farther by the trees and the clouds. Now, what Cézanne does next is this. More studies. At the top, an oil sketch for a much taller, more open composition, lighter and brighter, with trees and sky reaching higher above. There are more bathers, and they're divided into two groups with water visible in between them. At the bottom, a watercolor of bathers actually bathing in a river near a bridge down by the River Arc that Cézanne has known since he was a boy. These days, when it was hot, Cézanne had his coachman take him down there to swim. The climax of all of this was the third version, on an even bigger canvas. He projects the composition upward with trees that bend to form a pointed arch in the sky. Again, he's pulled the bathers apart into two groups. In between, no dog, no picnic, just a white cloth that the women bend toward and reach for. You can see he's imported some of these figures from the London version and reshaped others. Let's look at it for just a moment. The bathers are in an imaginary but believable place with water beyond them, and a meadow, and a village with a church steeple, maybe Provençal, but it can't really be identified. It's generic, anonymous, it's ideal. On the far side of the water, there's a fully clothed man looking towards the bathers, and there's an animal next to him, and I see it as a sheep, but I may be wrong. Cézanne has found his ultimate subject, an untroubled and uninhibited gathering in a hospitable place. Now it has amplitude. Now it is organized, but it's not explained or emphasized by any important actions or props. It's a place like the ones in Virgil's eclogues and in centuries of pastoral poems and landscape paintings. It's a place far from the crass values of the city. Cézanne knew the classical poetry, but was no pagan. These days he was going to church on Sundays. The pointed arch that frames the bathers suggests a Gothic portal. And I think the associations for these people are with righteousness, with divine sanction. A peculiarity of most of Cézanne's bathing scenes is that the gender of a lot of the bathers is ambiguous. The physiques don't proclaim male or female, and could be either, it could be both. In this picture, though, painted 30 years earlier, it's all boys. And the scene is set in the Arc Valley with Mont Saint-Victoire in the background. It's really a reminiscence of the carefree pleasures of Cézanne's reimagined boyhood in Aix with his trio or quartet of close friends, including reading Arcadian poetry and presumably getting to the Virgilian mood here, as well as swimming nude. That spirit was alive when he painted the large nude paintings, especially this one. And the bathers aren't all obviously female. And since he never finished the modeling, it's hard to tell in their patchy condition. I think Cézanne has left his feelings and his sensations for us to think about, not spelling them out, but suggesting them, and in effect, letting us complete the picture. Is it unfinished, or is it finished enough? Both things are true of many of Cézanne's last works. It's clear that the lower right is even patchier compared to the rest. So why are the anatomies so exaggerated, even distorted? Well, like caricature, it does make the poses more legible and emphatic. And why the confusion of genders? These bathers move entirely in relation to each other. They're not trying to seduce each other or you. In a few moments, this museum visitor is going to turn and look about 20 feet away at another large, famous, and important painting of bathers by an impressionist. Yes. 20 years earlier, Cézanne's friend Renoir had become disenchanted with painting the effects of light. In his word, he said, I've gone to the end of the Impressionism, and I was reaching the conclusion that I didn't know either to paint or to draw. In a word, I was at a dead end. Well, he couldn't bring himself to regress to the successful, slick style of Bouguereau at the far left. Although in the middle here, he felt he might be doing exactly that. And he needed the discipline of Cézanne's method, going back to the great sculptors and drawing and copying poses. And here at the top, the statue, the sculpture is Girardin's relief of bathers of the 17th century that he took for the model. Cézanne's two great projects in figure painting contrast in subjects about as completely as you could imagine. Nude bathers in the open air, on the one hand, a dream of youth and beauty and warmth and health. Ideals that have sustained Europeans through hard winters and brutal wars. And partly overlapping that project, portraits of real-life locals and 5 compositions of bundled-up men playing cards. His third project was to picture the land around him, mainly the vistas that he could walk to. Now he had techniques to embody some of the sensations he felt when he was in front of them and to convey them to others. We'll be back to that project very shortly, but meanwhile, another activity, not quite a project, but an activity that had begun 30 years before in the 1860s, using household vessels and fruit to make pictures that provide unexpected entertainment for the eyes and the mind. Many of you saw this picture at the end of the first lecture when I suggested that you try and figure out the space and the places that things occupy in the painting. You've seen him take liberties with perspective and gravitation in portraits, Madame Cézanne in particular. Here in the kitchen, things may look at first like they're helter-skelter, but of course, he's put things exactly where he wants. He's made them however big or small he wants, with just the right color relationships to make the whole ensemble come into balance, to our surprise, maybe. The table is crazy. That huge basket loaded with fruit hangs out into thin air. And what is the wooden leg at the far right sticking into the picture? It all adds up to an image of abundant, familiar stuff under the sole control of the artist in a space of his creating. This one seems to be about pure mischief. For anybody expecting a view into a believable room, not to mention a logical arrangement of objects that are in scale with one another, we're looking down at a suavely painted white plaster statue of a Cupid figure, striding forward, turning gracefully. It's in Cézanne's studio, and these are his paintings against the wall. He's got apples and onions as visitors to the studio. Very quickly, though, you can see that he's playing tricks. Like, what is the floor doing? It tips up so steeply, you wonder not only why the green apple at the top is so huge, but how it stays put up there. And that table, look over in the left side, where does it go? And what's become of the floor? He's put 2 onions among the apples, like goats among the sheep, and he makes them show off. The one at the right waving its shoots, and the other one confusing its shoots with the edge of whatever it is. At the far left, there are a couple of stray apples enveloped in a blue cloth. Where are they supposed to be? Well, the wonderful critic Lawrence Gowing came up with the answer. They're on another painting, this painting, which he had parked on the floor, Cézanne had, and I thought I better check that. So I made a detail of that area on the right side of the picture and tilted it, and of course, Gowing was right. I noticed that the left-hand onion adds to the mischief with the line of its neck that coincides with the edge of what turns out to be the bottom edge of the painting behind on the floor. So Cézanne's painting invites us to think about it, peel, so to say, peel the onion of fact and fiction in it, starting with the mythical love child, Cupid, then the live boy who served the sculptor as a model for Cupid, then the resulting sculpture, then a copy of that sculpture cast in plaster for the artist, and then finally this painting of the plaster cast by Cézanne. He, of course, is playing with our expectations, of conventional still life, of academic illusions of space, of consistent scale, single viewpoint, all that. But for most of us, the philosophical messing around I'm doing is upstaged by the experience of this miraculously accurate and vivid fruit and veg, and the intense blotches of color and the incisive marks for the blemishes and stem holes of the fruit. While we're on the subject of fruit at play, look for just a moment at this little table at the Met with two teams of fruit separated, kind of in formation, 4 robust apples in red uniforms, 4 smaller pears in green, huddling, not engaging. Is it in balance or not? Cézanne put them there with great care to pose that very question for you as you look and think. Cézanne has other props in the studio, ones that are old in the history of still life painting. He adds some extras for effect there on the left, this conspicuous tear in the dark wall hanging, the dark sprays of leaves, one black leaf blighting the apple in the very center, the pear at the very right edge of the table, lending a precarious touch to the whole thing, with the implication that life itself is like this, precarious. Cézanne painted half a dozen paintings of skulls during these years, not just as a personal memento mori, but it's been suggested that it's also because his lifelong friend Marion had recently died, the eminent paleontologist who excavated prehistoric skulls in Provençal's caves not far from here. I think the watercolor is ironically sumptuous, joyous color and pattern supporting 3 bleached skulls. It's there to stir thoughts of life and death, antiquity and the present. How Cézanne saw it, we can only guess. Cézanne gave this young man a pose and props that any educated person during the last 400 years could have recognized. The weary lean of the sufferer from melancholy, the skull and books and papers were all reminders of the vanity or the futility of learning in view of the inevitability of death. The complicated patterns of the hanging on the wall behind him may suggest something of the state of his thought. Cézanne's experiments in space and volume in still life become less extreme with time. In this one, the forward tilt is there, letting us see more of what's on the table, and that is familiar vessels and fabrics. Also some familiar uncertainties, like the fate of the leaning sugar jar and the really delicious textures of the paint. Just let your eyes wander. Look at the green pot and take in the soft sheen on the glaze, the mouth obligingly warped forward by the artist for us to see and peer into. Look at the highlights on the blue pot and notice again how he paints apples with the fewest strokes and manages to get every peculiarity of shape and color. You discover that the familiar white cloth isn't really white. It is light gray and purple blue with rose and green folding over it. There are still surprises, though, at this date as well. Here on the left, the flat table with fruits plays no tricks, the fruits either, but behind that, we are lost. Where exactly is that jug? Is it on the floor behind where the frames are and some stray fruits? And what are the paintings leaning on? Whatever it is, we don't see it. I need to do at least a little justice to the still lifes that Cézanne drew and painted in watercolor. This medium gave him a way to rehearse major compositions, like the one on the left, and also to test various ingredients that he didn't include in oil paintings. And by test, I mean not just try the objects out, but also dismiss them when they had served their purpose, leaving lots of paper exposed. Because Cézanne was painting for himself, not for the market. I should add that most of these watercolors have come down to us a bit faded, or very faded, from exposure to light. Others have survived better, and once in a while we have a pair of siblings, like this one, to compare. The robust version on the right has been spared fading. It's also brilliantly analyzed and put in context by our Yale colleague Carol Armstrong in a book on the subject of Cézanne's watercolor still lifes, which you should get if you can buy one. A few details, though, are just going to have to suffice. To give you an idea how the layering of translucent washes does the work, suggests depth, shadows, everything. And how luminous the effect of this table covering is, how spontaneous it seems, how completely dazzling. Here's an unfinished still life in oil. You heard Cézanne say more than once that he doesn't strive to portray the appearance of things, but the sensations that they cause in him. He said to a young artist, "I cannot convey my sensation immediately, so I put color on again, and I keep putting it on as best I can. But when I begin, I always try to paint sweepingly, like Manet, by giving form with the brush." Here you see sweeping black outlines, defining the tablecloth, parts of the curtain, and some of the objects. You also see that he's just blocked in big areas with blotchy color, the purple wall, the tablecloth at the right in blue, and the left in yellow ochre. He undoubtedly intended to come back to those, but didn't. Meanwhile, he's positioning the main players, the fruits, so that the colors connect, that the red apples at the far left and far right, yellow ones getting smaller as they go back to the dish full of green plums. And he's just started the pattern on the curtain and let it go. You have a sense of his working all over to keep things in balance in relation to the whole, and then, for some reason, giving it up. We left Cézanne in the studio with his bathers. Here he is outdoors performing for Émile Bernard and Carrousel in 1906, at work at what would be his last great project, views of the valley and the mountains that he lived with. He's been painting a couple of miles down the road in the valley at the Château Noir, a partly ruined faux medieval country house, and the spooky cliffs and the steep rocky grounds that you have been seeing him painting in the previous lecture, and the trees around its ruins, buildings. Back in the studio, it's a short walk uphill to a place with a view across the valley to the Arc River and the Mont Sainte-Victoire. Here he painted about a dozen views. Those seem to have been alternated with days spent painting down at the Château Noir. That mountain was always in his life. It's the most conspicuous thing in this part of Provence. And it appears in drawings like this one at the upper left since the 18th century. Cézanne had already painted views of the valley and the mountain ever since he returned to Aix in the late 70s, you see at the right. Well, in this view from a hill north of Aix, he makes a panorama of the valley with a patchwork, green farm fields and meandering roads, and the mountain just appearing between the tall pine trees. Halfway up the valley, you can see the viaduct for a new railroad line cutting through, a reminder of the ancient history of the region, when you might have seen a Roman aqueduct instead, but this one belonged to the new industrial reality, this viaduct, a reality of the late 19th century, which the artist did not disguise. In other versions of this view, Cézanne puts the mountain at the center and paints pine boughs overhead that he's made to undulate with the contour of the mountain. A little farther down, he found a stone-walled terrace where the view was a little different, partly framed by trees and painted with softer greens and yellows. Higher up and to the north, the great art historian and Cézanne researcher John Rewald photographed condition not very different in the 1930s from what Cézanne painted, but much more heavily wooded. When you go to Aix and wander around the neighborhood of Les Louvres, which is where Cézanne's studio was, in search of the view on the right, you may find it, and you may feel some disappointment at what's grown up in between. This photographer did some photoshopping in the foreground to supply the wall in his picture. But a half a mile up the road to the north, you begin to see what you are coming to look for. The mountain summit takes on the shape of a beak or a tooth. It looks like what Cézanne chose to paint starting in around 1900. You won't have to be a trespasser, by the way. You just follow the signs on the Avenue Paul Cézanne that leads to a little park called the Terrain des Peintres that's part of a suburban development. If you crop out a few roofs and cypresses, you'll have an image of what Cézanne saw. Plus, if you want, you can have a look at reproductions of his pictures to orient you. They would show you, among other things, that Cézanne moved around a lot. These two views are 20 years apart, both at the Met, obviously not painted from the same vantage point. The left-hand view is from a point at the edge of Aix and shows that broad, gentle valley. The picture at the right was made from above the hill where the mountain is jutting up behind. This is the locale that occupied him for the last years of his life. It was going to keep revealing subtle differences that he could and did respond to. Often these views of Mont Saint-Victoire by Cézanne are called a series and treated as sort of Cézanne's counterpart to a series of paintings by his friend Claude Monet. Particularly these views from the same viewpoint of the same subject, the Cathedral of Rouen, at different times of day, different weather, each one making different sensations. That approach was not Cézanne's. He believed that even a short distance up or down or sideways gave him all the variety he needed. Seizing transient effects of light and weather were not for him. These two pictures hang next to each other in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'd like us to look at the two of them for just a minute and consider what Cézanne was trying to do and see if you think either of the two is more satisfying than the other. I'll just give you a minute to think about that. Well, both have three horizontal zones, a dark one at the bottom. The middle zone is the brightest, with green and ochre patches. A few red roofs scattered around are pretty much all there is to signal buildings. In the picture at the left, the patches are more distinct, more defined looking, and the foreground trees and buildings are lower in relation to the whole. These relationships were vitally important to Cézanne. On the left, the road is less prominent, but on the right, the clouds add more action and change. You may find the left-hand version more successful. Other people have differed. When you look up close, you realize that nobody but Cézanne himself had ever painted a finished work of art this way, with such an audacious mix of brushstrokes. Wide, square-top strokes, parallel verticals, kind of washy infill, and the last, dark accents to strengthen the suggestion of forms. Now, if you moved your easel to the left about 50 feet and go backward 50 feet to include some olive grove in your view and turn the canvas 90 degrees, you've got a very different composition. There's there's less serene middle ground. There's no suggestion of a grid or of linear perspective. It's trees that are the main actors. Which of these did he paint first? We don't know. He didn't date any of these paintings, and opinions vary by several years or more. He was using watercolor to make studies. At the left, you can see it's just the barest elements. The mountain in blue, emphasizing its sort of dromedary shape. The long ochre ridge below it that cuts off its lower slopes from many different points of view. And with no pencil lines to guide him, just some blips for detail here and there. Notations for trees or bits of flat ground. Or more elaborate watercolor drawings like the one in the middle, vertical now, a test of the composition, with shivery outlines and pale colors that have little to do with the oil painting. The watercolors are sometimes made on the same spots, but aren't preparatory in the usual sense. With these, he took description in watercolor as far as he needed to go, whether it was as a finished work or a guide for painting in oil. On the left, the trunks of the trees sort of undulate with rhythms that energize the middle ground. On the right, seen from higher up and farther back, he sees more variety of shapes and more scattering of color. Several of these views in oil are darker, showing either a later time of day or more clouds. The mood is different. And just as striking, there isn't any longer that exhilarating sense of deep space in the middle. It's more like a wall. There's a house in the middle, and behind it a mass of squarish forms that have their own abstract life, their own relationships. There's also bare spots where the white ground shows through, sometimes depicting light on the clouds and sometimes just not finished at the edges. You see this in the watercolors. Here is Cézanne explaining this unfinished quality to a painter friend in 1905. Now, he said, being old, nearly 70 years, the sensations of color which give the light offer me the reasons for the abstractions, which do not allow me to cover the canvas entirely, nor to pursue the delimitation of the objects where their points of contact are fine or delicate, and from which it results that my depiction in the painting is incomplete. He makes the color patches even bigger, quite amazing here in the foreground, and suggests old-fashioned perspective with some converging diagonals here and there to give a sense of deep space. They are surprising colors, ochre patch on the mountain, green clouds, a spot of hot red almost in the center, buried in the greens. For me, the most astonishing of these views is this one in Basel. You recognize the road, the foreground house, and the mountain. The rest is suggestion, with excitement supplied by the dazzling summit at the top, and at the bottom, a strange blue cloud in the lower left that seems to rise up through the trees near the cluster of colors for the buildings. This is as visionary as Cézanne gets, as turbulent and as emotionally charged. The painter and critic Lawrence Gowing wrote, Cézanne's patches do not represent materials or facets or variations of tint. In themselves, they do not represent anything. It's the relationships between them, relationships of affinity and contrast, the progressions from tone to tone in a color scale, and the modulations from scale to scale that parallel the apprehension of the world. The sense of these color patches rests on their juxtapositions and their alignment one with another. So we aren't to look for representation, says Gowing. Cézanne himself says in his own words that it's his sensation that he wants to convey with these patches of color, his own mix of excitement and wonderment, joy, apprehension, even fear, that we may be able to sense by looking. There were eyewitnesses, a handful of people who came to see him at his studio in the last couple of years of his life. The painters Maurice Denis on the right and Ker Roussel behind the camera on the left. Cézanne was going on 90. He was weakened by diabetes. He was alternately charming and irritable, a defiant loner. He wrote to his son, the weather is stormy and changeable. My nervous system is very weak, and only oil painting can keep me up. I must carry on. I must produce after nature. He'd been painting outside near the studio a couple of days later when he was caught in a violent thunderstorm and collapsed. And after a while, he was carried back to his apartment in Aix in a laundry wagon and put to bed. He felt better that night, well enough to work on a portrait of Vallier, his gardener. He got weaker, and in the following week, he died. Cézanne had said he wanted to die painting, and he got his wish. He didn't die obscure. But in the 1890s, a few dealers and collectors and critics had predicted a future for his work, artists as well. But it hadn't been easy to see the work, as you've heard, and it had exhibited a few times in the 1870s with the Impressionists. It was the show organized by Vollard in 1895 that won over many more critics and artists. And the auction of a major collector, Victor Choquet, Vollard bought everything left in Cézanne's studio after his death. And Vollard put on another exhibition where Matisse bought a picture. In 1900, Denis had gathered a group of artists who were Cézanne's admirers and painted this portrayal of them discussing a great still life by Cézanne that many of you will remember from the first lecture, if not from the galleries at MoMA, where it lives. At the far left is Odilon Redon. In the middle, gesturing, is Paul Sérusier. The dealer Vollard is the tall one with a nice firm grip on the easel, appropriately. Pierre Bonnard is in the far right with a walking stick and pipe. Picasso's biographer, John Richardson, wrote that Cézanne's death in 1906 left many of the more progressive young artists hoping that his spirit might move on in their work. The dealers Bernheim Jeune organized an exhibition of 79 watercolors, few of which had ever been out of the studio. Many artists were stunned. Picasso was amazed at their incompleteness and their, what he called, intrinsic completeness. He said later, as soon as Cézanne begins to make the first stroke, the picture is already there. He'd been shown 3 years earlier at the Salon d'Automne, and then in October 1907, several rooms in the Grand Palais were devoted to 56 works by Cézanne. That's the portrait bust of Cézanne by his friend Philippe Solari, which gets something of his curmudgeonly side. At the same time, his letters to Émile Bernard came out in print, including Cézanne's alleged advice that painters should treat nature by means of the cylinder, sphere, and cone. Cézanne's paintings fired artists' imaginations and have given them courage ever since. His career also has been an example of hard labor and integrity and perseverance. His afterlife among artists has been the subject of books and exhibition catalogs that are easily gotten. Two recent shows, one in Philadelphia and the other in Chicago just last year, demonstrated how the artists of the 20th century had direct and indirect relationships with Cézanne's pictures and his ideas. And you'll find them in the list of suggested readings that we put on the website. I'm going to take just a few more minutes on the first wave of Cézanne's influence, on Matisse and Picasso and Braque. Matisse, who was 30 years younger and evidently never met Cézanne, bought this little painting by Cézanne when he was newly married and struggling. For Cézanne, it was one of his many visions of paradise, of warmth and freedom without guilt, as you've been seeing, climaxing in the Large Bathers the year Cézanne died, and the year that Matisse painted his early masterpiece, The Joy of Life, Le Bonheur de Vivre, in the middle, the audacious painting of nudes that's similar in size and ambition to Cézanne's, but blazing with strange new colors. The following year, after a trip to North Africa, Matisse painted a nude that I suspect was partly a tribute to Cézanne, who had submitted a nude in similar twisting pose for the Salon of 1870 that was, of course, refused and was parodied in a cartoon that Matisse very likely saw. Cézanne's original has been lost, though, so we can't be sure. His little painting for Cézanne was something of a talisman for him. When Matisse set up a teaching studio in 1908, he made a practice of bringing the picture to the studio to show students. He said, "In moments of doubt, when I was still searching for myself, frightened sometimes by my discovery, I thought, if Cézanne is right, I am right." And I knew that Cézanne had made no mistake. So Cézanne was also the ancestor of Cubism by a slightly complicated genealogy, which I will trace very quickly through Picasso and Braque. Here are the three large showpieces of 1906 and 1907, Cézanne's Large Bathers and the Matisse Bonheur de Vivre, both agreeable fantasies. Picasso had studied both of them, and his Demoiselle d'Avignon is a nightmare vision of 5 life-size naked prostitutes with bizarre features. A defiant answer to his contemporary and rival Matisse, certainly. And I think the Demoiselle had a closet relationship, however, to Cézanne. Picasso saw a lot of Cézanne's at Vollard's gallery, and I think this one included, this group of nudes by Cézanne bathing. Picasso made one of those astonishing leaps from one imaginative world into another, from Cézanne's wholesome outdoor bathers to Picasso's back alley Barcelona Amazons displaying themselves. In any case, Picasso at 24 had already made his way into a left bank studio of modernist art and literature, the apartment of Gertrude and Leo Stein, where they hung Cézanne's portrait of Hortense there on the left, and Picasso's freshly painted portrait of Gertrude displayed as a kind of companion piece to the Cézanne. Picasso advertised Cézanne as his spiritual father. After painting the Demoiselle and challenged by Cézanne's 3 large bathers, and having seen all 3 of Cézanne's bather compositions, Picasso launched a series of bathers himself. Here's one of those right in the middle. Once more, the three big pictures of 1906 and 7, where Matisse's painting was a spectacular advertisement for what became known as the Fauve group, one of whose members was Georges Braque on the left, who spent summers working at no other place than L'Estaque, where Cézanne had spent a lot of time. Braque working in a colorful, high-key Fauve style based on Matisse. Like Picasso and Matisse, Braque absorbed lessons from the great exhibition of Cézanne's work in 1907, and the next summer, he painted this. One of a series of audacious landscapes that would soon get the name Cubist. And anybody could see that they sprang from Cézanne's geometrical structures. Landscapes like these that meant space and volume in the real world could be manipulated in a way that almost freed them from recognition. That's where Braque broke through with Cézanne's help, and Picasso was barely half a step behind Braque. Working in Provence in 1909 and inspired by Cézanne and Braque, Picasso transformed views into near abstractions, using drastically simple shapes and very few color. Picasso and Braque were studying Cézanne's still lifes too. Picasso, here in the middle, takes the suggestion from Cézanne that the composition doesn't have to be finished out to the edges. Braque, at the left, not only shatters and reorganizes multiple views of a metronome and reduces their colors, but he also adopts Cézanne's system of modeling with diagonal hatching in near monochrome. Cubist images could not only be nearly abstract, nearly monochrome, nearly flat, like Cézanne, they could, like Cézanne, abolish the fiction of a single space. You'll be glad to know we have to stop here. I'm ending, though, with a hope that you'll feel moved to do what Cézanne trusted you would. His expression more or less says it for me. Go to his actual paintings, look patiently, observe your own sensations as you do, give them the time, give them the patient, open-minded attention that you've been kind enough to give to me. Thank you.